Welcome to Blindspot. I'm Steve Reardon. It is my pleasure to have Kori with me in studio today. Dr. Schake is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. She is the editor with Jim Mattis of the book Warrior and Citizens, American View of Our Military. She teaches thinking about war at Stanford, is a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, and a contributor to War on the Rocks. Her history of the Anglo-American hegemonic transition is forthcoming from Harvard University Press. She has served in various roles, including at the White House for the National Security Council, at the Department of Defense for the of the Secretary and Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the State Department for the Policy Planning Staff. During the 2008 presidential election, she was senior policy advisor on the McCain-Palin campaign. Kori Schake, welcome to Blindspot.
It is such a joy to be with you, Steve.
So I wanted to say that when I came to Stanford, you were the first person I looked up. I've been listening to you on the ER for over a year, maybe 18 months now, and it's a real treat for me to have you. I think just to say the education I've had on foreign policy, listening to you and reading your work has been fantastic. So I'm incredibly honored that you've joined me here today.
That makes me so happy. You know, when I'm in government jobs, I'm always shocked when people either think I'm a sort of shameless political hack or a ruthless killer.
Right.
Because what I so obviously look like to myself is a school teacher. So I love it that that's what I sounded like to you.
Right. So, I mean, it's no secret you're a Republican. It's now just over a week since the Republican nominee swept to victory in the general election. So I guess I presume it's been continuous champagne parties in the hot tub in the Schake household for 7 days. Is that a fair reflection?
No. In part because I'm a signatory of, I think, every one of the national security letters of Republicans opposing Donald Trump for reasons both of policy and temperament. I actually think he's unsuited to run the country. And the second reason there isn't an enormous amount of enthusiasm in the Schake household at the moment is I have the pleasure of the fact that my sweet sister is recuperating from her work on the Clinton campaign by spending some time with me. So even if I had a Republican candidate I was wildly enthusiastic about voting for, I would be toning it down to be nice to my kid sister.
Right. So, I mean, I wanted to ask you about that because I guess it's come up in a bunch of interviews and press. There were a lot of signatories, especially in the foreign policy community, but even outside of that, saying that they would never support a Trump presidency. Now, I guess somewhat predictably, after the victory, a few of them are saying, well, but – and there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, obviously there are some people who, want a job and want the position. But there are some arguments that there is a moral, even an ethical reason to go and be part of the administration to try and prevent the worst from happening. Do you buy any of that?
Actually, I buy a lot of that. Right. I can think of a whole host of ethically serious reasons for people who had opposed Trump's candidacy to join his administration. Let me start by saying I'm not going to be one of them.
Kori, we were all hoping to see you in Washington.
Thank you for that vote of confidence, my friend, but no. But here are the really good, serious arguments, I think, for people who aren't me to do it. The first is that those of us who had opposed Trump's candidacy were quite vocal about it. We were all over the media doing it. We didn't lack for opportunities to make our case, and voters chose him anyway. And so I think a lot of folks who didn't want to help him get elected can and should help him govern, because the American people made their choice in full knowledge of our views and decided in his favor anyway. The second good reason for helping him is that he's not a particularly experienced national policymaker, and he's going to need a whole lot of help. And people serve the republic well by helping President Trump govern well. The third good, serious reason is if you are worried about the behavior of a potential Trump administration, bearing witness to mistakes, writing the 173rd memo saying why this is a bad idea, is a form of moral seriousness,
right.
And will help ensure the accountability that every American president needs to keep him or her honest.
Right.
So I can think of a whole bunch of good reasons.
Yeah. So if you take the other path, what is the role for concerned Republicans, concerned foreign policy people, and I guess concerned liberals everywhere? What do you do? Like, what do you do over the next 4 to 8 years?
Yeah. One of my personal heroes is an activist and lawyer, now deceased, by the name of Elizabeth Fink. And in last year's end of the year New York Times obituaries highlights had one about her in which she jubilantly said, what a great privilege it was to spend her working life defending the Constitution against its number one enemy, the government of the United States. And I'm trying to channel Elizabeth Fink's joy at keeping government honest.
Okay.
I think, in a lot of ways, one lesson I take from this election, given that 46% of American voters didn't vote, and given that a lot of people who protested the election outcome afterwards also didn't bother to vote, is that our country works best when we all participate in it. And there is so much good work to do, helping your members of Congress to accurately reflect your concerns, to make good policy, to support good journalism where it's occurring, and to, in general, embolden civic society, because civic society, so much more than our government, defines us and helps us make good choices in this world. Right.
I think so. One of the things that in this eternal search that people have been on for the last the last week or two, the eternal search for a silver lining. People have said, well, the one thing we can hope is that maybe President-elect Trump will pick, the best and most fantastic team around him. Early indications are not strong that this is happening, and I guess I want to focus in from you, because it's something I want to learn a little bit more about, around the discussion around General Flynn and the discussion around the National Security Advisor. So I guess what I'm interested in is what does that role encompass? How important is it, and what authority does it have? Because I think it's something that's really not understood that well in the general electorate.
Yeah, I think the kind of best frame of reference for thinking about the National Security Advisor's job is as the conductor of a symphony. Right? Like, the president gets to determine what gets played. Right. And it's the National Security Advisor's job to keep the virtuoso cellist and the lead violin in sync together. And so the members of the cabinet, the people who are confirmed by the Congress to spend our money, to take executive action on behalf of the president, run their departments. And when the interagency works best, it works best because the National Security Advisor understands what the president wants to get done, both his priorities and his overall policies. So the National Security Advisor can prioritize activity for everybody else, can make sure things move in concert one with the other. The National Security Council staff, what they do is, first of all, they staff the president, the people who make sure that you have the right phone number if you want to talk to the German chancellor, and more importantly, the background information that will help you have a productive conversation.
There's a huge assumption that Donald Trump is going to be phoning the German chancellor, but it may be useful. Who knows?
Yeah, I wouldn't think it's going to happen anytime soon. It was at least a tactical mistake to have published the school teachery counsel she gave the new president of the United States.
Yeah.
But the National Security Council is staff, not line, right? They don't, as Steve Hadley used to scold me when I was galloping off the reservation, that what they do is they advise the president, they staff the president, they help the interagency coordinate its activity. And in order to do that well, it typically is enormously helpful for the National Security Advisor to have worked at a senior level in one or more of the departments. It also, the most important thing, Steve Hadley gave me an interview for a project I was doing on how the interagency functions, and he so memorably said, presidents get the interagencies they deserve. Right. Because if you pick a group of cabinet members that you trust, that are capable of running large departments well, that play nice with each other, then the whole thing works. If you look at the Scowcroft model of the interagency, which even Henry Kissinger says it works better than any other, but the problem is everybody has to be good at their jobs. And so typically people can't make the Scowcroft model work because there will be at least one outlier in the cabinet that the president doesn't trust or isn't any good at their job or doesn't play nice with others. And that starts making the work slows way down, big mistakes happen.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think, so from the outside looking in, I want to read you something. Michael Thomas Mike Flynn, born December 1958, a retired United States Army Lieutenant General who served as Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Commander of the Joint Functional Component Command for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, and Chair of the Military Intelligence Board, and also Assistant Director of National Intelligence. Most people would read that and say, well, what's wrong with that? That makes sense, right?
Yeah, and he may turn out to be terrific.
Why are they wrong?
I'm not sure they are wrong.
Okay.
There's
been a lot of criticism about him in I guess the foreign policy community and in the press more generally about his potential appointment.
I think there are three serious criticisms of him. Well, there may be many. There are three that ring true for me. The first is that he did all those jobs in a way that broke a lot of China in the doing of them.
Right.
That alienated a lot of his peers and subordinates in the doing of them. And that's not ideal for somebody who's the conductor of an orchestra. So how he does business, I think, may be problematic because this is a team sport. Mm. The second criticism of him is that he is currently and has previously been in violation of the norms that govern civil-military relations in the United States. That is, that while on active duty, he did not respect that the elected leaders of our country get to determine whether or not to take the military's advice. They have a responsibility to listen to it. They have no responsibility to take it. And in his behavior on the campaign trail, I think he traduced those lines in ways that are actually quite damaging to the American military and its relationship to the civilian society it serves. Mm. The third criticism of Flynn is that very many of the views he espoused on the campaign trail and wrote about in his book are inconsistent with who we are as a diverse and vibrant society governed by law. And so in that regard, the good side is he's very much in sync with the elected president's policies and perspectives.
Yeah.
The downside is he's unlikely to be a calming or attenuating factor when those policies aren't legal, aren't prudent, aren't conducive to advancing the country's interests.
Mm. I mean, one of my, a senior military fellow of mine gave me the view that actually having a national security advisor who was former or part of the military was a bad idea, and that appointment should be a civilian appointment.
I don't share that view,
okay,
to be honest, for a couple of reasons. First is that I don't think veterans should be excluded from any job on the basis of
right.
having served their country. Second of all, what the American military is brilliant at is structuring problems so that you get the right information to make good decisions and organizing teams such that you hear a diversity of voices, you make a decision, and you execute it smartly. And actually, those people are in relatively short supply in the Washington policy community. So a lot of military people from Andrew Goodpaster to Brent Scowcroft have held the job and done it extraordinarily well. The third advantage, I think, of military, or the third reason I would advocate a military person can and should do that, is that, we are now, 40-some years into having an all-volunteer force. And the force that we have is professional, so it stays in service for longer periods of time. And because our country has had the good fortune of not needing a larger standing military, less than 0.5% of Americans have military service. And what I noticed and Jim Mattis noticed in the surveys done for our book, Warriors and Citizens, is that the American public is increasingly outsourcing its judgment on issues of war and peace to the military. And so there are not a lot of people in the Washington policy community who think strategically, who are knowledgeable about these issues. And so there's a real repository of expertise that military people have that not that many other Americans have that will be important in doing that job well.
I think it's a super important point. And I think actually your book, Warriors and Citizens, covers it really well. And I'd recommend my listeners to pick it up. I also think Rosa Brooks's book does a good job at illustrating that exact point as well. So just while we're staying on picks, and I really want to move on to foreign policy, and it's outside our realm a little bit, but Steve Bannon, as being one of the most important people in the White House, that's got to erode some confidence in at least Trump's judgment about these picks, surely.
I do not believe it will erode confidence in Trump's judgment because I believe before the Bannon appointment, he had already produced an enormous pool of data that should have made people believe that these were the kinds of appointments he would make.
Okay. But not good for the country, not good for relations, not good for the professionalism of the White House, right?
I think he represents the worst and most dangerous elements of President-elect Trump's policies and temperament. But elections have consequences, and the president has a right to surround himself with counselors who reinforce his views and his policies.
So I want to move on to foreign policy for a little bit. I think the interesting thing is the way the powers are distributed at the moment. There is definitely a sense that on domestic policy, presidents are constrained to a large degree by the institutions, but they actually have a much wider breadth of decision-making ability in the foreign policy arena. So I'd like to get your take on that and I guess why that is. And without just asking a ton of questions we don't know the answers to, what are your predictions for what a Donald Trump foreign policy looks like?
Okay, so I'll take the institutional question first.
Yeah.
So yes, the president has much wider latitude on foreign policy than he does on domestic policy, because for the most part, he doesn't have to deal with the Congress hammer and tongs all of the time. The 18th century geniuses who formed our government. Right, like the joke in American politics is that we have a government designed by geniuses to be run by idiots, and it most often is.
Right.
And
we're stretching that at this moment in time, potentially.
So foreign policy doesn't cost money as a day-to-day undertaking in the way that domestic policy does, so Congress has less latitude. It's less constrained by legislation. But the Congress, and third, the president as commander-in-chief is constitutionally given the authority for running our day-to-day foreign relations, for crafting treaties that then go before the Congress for their advice and consent.
It does feel very anachronistic in our current environment, though. I mean, it maybe makes sense in the 18th century, but today all of these foreign policy decisions have massive ramifications, right?
Okay, but they always did.
Right.
Math class isn't newly hard. Math class has always been hard.
Okay.
And the Congress has refused the president's judgment on an enormous swath of treaties, right? Think about the treaties with Britain in the late 19th century that Congress, sometimes for reasons of ethnicity and racism, would refuse to agree that the English should be given a treaty with our country. And sometimes for very practical reasons, that they wanted a wider latitude of unilateral responsibility than the president, in his wisdom, believed was possible to take. So, yeah, Congress is always uppity about a lot of these things, and they should be.
Right.
They have been more a force for good on Iran policy, with the sanctions they have insisted on over the objections of the last three presidents. So just because they're a stampede doesn't mean they're always wrong on stuff. And you know that American government was designed to do nothing unless you can get a wide consensus of people to do something. And that therein lies our safety, not just now, but always.
Right. So he does have more latitude in foreign policy. What is he going to use that latitude to do?
So I think the best guide I have seen was written last January by Tom Wright from Brookings. And what he did was look back over all of Trump's speeches and interviews and everything else since the 1970s. And what Tom found, and I'm quite persuaded from his article he's right, is that there are very strong consistencies over time in Donald Trump's thinking.
What?
Yeah, actually true. Unfortunately, they're like a mosquito trapped in amber in the late 1970s, right? Trade is terrible for the United States. I've seen that movie,
Kori. It didn't end up well.
The Japanese, Jurassic Park is not so good. Well, it has kind of a happy ending after a whole bunch of death and destruction.
Yeah.
But that his views on trade are anachronistic to the late 1970s. His views on Asia are anachronistic to the late 1970s.
Yeah.
His views on dealing with authoritarian powers are Cold War détente attitudes, not post-Cold War, bend the arc of history toward justice kind of views. So that's the way to think about it. I suppose the good news is that he's not particularly ideological. He reverses himself on stuff all of the time, which may mean he can be talked into more sensible positions once he's off the campaign trail and responsible for outcomes.
Would you say something specifically like, I guess, the Iran deal? Do you think he will do away with that, and was that a good or a bad thing in your mind?
I think that is a much more complex subject than he has given sophisticated thought to.
Right. That doesn't necessarily mean he won't make a decision on it, Kori.
I agree, which takes us to a really important point, though.
Yeah.
If you want good policy outcomes, you shouldn't be rushing him.
Okay.
You shouldn't be rushing him into cabinet appointments. You shouldn't be rushing him into major policy decisions, because it may be true that no amount of time or persuasion has any effect on him, but it is certainly true that he is capable of erratic choices, and if you rush him, he is very likely to make erratic choices.
I'll stop tweeting him at 3 a.m. talking about who his Secretary of Defense is going to be.
If you're going to tweet him at 3 o'clock in the morning, tweet him suggestions of who good secretaries of defense would be, right? Flood the zone with good counsel if you're going to play in the zone.
Who would be a good secretary of defense for you? Who do you think he should be appointing and looking at?
I think Steve Hadley, who was the national security advisor in the Bush administration, would be a terrific Secretary of Defense. There are a number of budget hawks on Capitol Hill who would be interesting secretaries of defense because they would bring a perspective of what was Eisenhower's great phrase, security and solvency. We owe the country both. And that would be a useful perspective to have in the Secretary of Defense. You know, we very often lose sight of the fact that most of defense policy actually gets made by the Congress. In the authorization and appropriation bills, they determine the size of the Army, what pay raises are going to be, what kind of weapons we are going to buy or not buy. So having a Secretary of Defense who knows how to deal effectively with the Congress is actually a much more important qualification than somebody knowledgeable about policy.
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time looping back to the idea of these civil-military relationships. It seems to be it's a very hot topic, and it has been for a long time. I spoke with Dr. Perry a few weeks ago. I was at the DEF conference on the weekend as well, and it continually comes up. So I guess what I'm interested in is it something that is partisan? So having a Republican wave at the moment, does that help? Or is it a much more complicated societal issue with nuance and stuff that's, hard for our brains to think about, and we don't like thinking that way?
It's...
and I guess what do we do? Like, that's the thing that always comes back to, like, what do you practically do about this?
Yeah. So at the high policy level, it's not that partisan. It is true that the majority of American military officers are conservatives, but the fundamental insight to this comes from Elliot Cohen, and he said it during the 2000 election campaign, which was that it was really important for George Bush to get elected president in 2000 so that the military could learn to hate Republicans again. Right? Because the friction in high policy civil-military relations in the United States isn't new. It's not specific to one political party.
Yeah.
Right? We have a government designed by people who think putting interests in conflict is how you get good government decision-making. Yeah. And because nothing can happen without broader consensus. And so we have not, in the last several years, had a particularly high level of civil-military friction. I don't expect that civil-military friction will go away just because a Republican has been elected.
There was that hope. We keep looking at the silver lining, and you keep dashing me here.
And in the civic space, in the relationship between Americans and their military, there is, because we have such a small military and so much of our military live on large bases in places that they have little everyday contact with people, there is a tendency to either treat our military as, broad-shouldered comic book heroes who never do wrong, or victims, right? Like everybody has PTSD and they're going to be a danger in our workplace.
Yeah.
And of course, both of those are wrong.
Right.
They are citizens like the rest of us. Folks who do military service in the United States tend to have a stronger sense of contribution to their community. It's not surprising that a much higher proportion of veterans run for public office than average Americans run for public office, that they are disproportionately large contributors to civic good in our societies. They are normal Americans that we need to get our arms around and treat like normal Americans, because that's the best and most fostering kind of civil-military relationship. and it is the one that best rewards the service of those who do it.
I think the one thing that I always come back to is just the general lack of information and knowledge that the average population has about. So it's this interesting thing that you highlight in the book. It's this idea of they have an incredibly high approval rating. People look up to them. It's this thing, but actually people have very little knowledge or information about what they do.
Yes, and of course the aggravation of that is we are living in a time of tidal waves of information.
Yeah.
People are ignorant by choice.
Yeah.
They're not
great podcasts that illuminate some of these issues, right?
So the bad news is people don't bother to be informed about it for the most part. And scolds like me need to constantly remind them and encourage them that this is a civic responsibility. It is not the job of the American military to become more and more like civilian society. It is the responsibility of civilian society to understand and foster our military, who shoulders the burden of keeping us safe so that pedantic college professors can mouth off about our civic responsibilities.
Right. Okay. So I know you're under time. There's so much to cover, but we maybe we can chat again. So just the last question is, if you look at President Trump, you look at the team he's assembling now, and you project yourself over the next 4 years, what are you most worried about? And I guess, what are you most hopeful about?
I am most worried about the president and his team taking reckless decisions fast, whether that is in the near term in setting policies, withdrawing for the U.S.-Japanese defense alliance, for example, which is something he campaigned on. That would actually be extraordinarily bad for our country, but making decisions before they have thought their way through the downstream consequences of those choices, or making reckless decisions in crisis where time is at an essence. A North Korean launch where you don't know whether the missile can reach the United States or not, and whether there's a weapon, a nuclear weapon attached to that. So because I think their judgment is intemperate, and that's worrisome. What am I most hopeful about?
Yeah.
I am
It's got to be a silver lining.
Absolutely. The United States is not newly a country full of crazy people run by reckless politicians. That is mostly what we have been throughout our history. And the checks and balances in the American system, and attentive public, tiresome journalists who insist on the truth and exposure of corruption, which I think could be a major problem in a Trump administration, or bad policy choices, the civic activism that holds our government's feet to the fire to do what is good for the country, an empowered Congress that takes its responsibility as a counterweight to the executive branch seriously. There are so many and such varied ways that the United States is a vibrant society, and very few of them are actually either within the power of the President of the United States to affect or emanate out from that. So yeah, I think this is a wonderful country because so few things about it are in our government's ability to control.
Kori Schake, thank you very much for coming on Blindspot.
It was such a pleasure, Steve.